Right, great. Good morning. I think it is still morning in London. It is very early in the morning here in the United States, but I'm so pleased to be here with you all. And thank you so much, Kevin, for organizing this important conference and giving us the opportunity to talk about the status quo and why it can be troublesome. I appreciate that Jeanette talked to us about different stakeholders and how language falls on people. For me, in what I do, I am a professor of law at Georgetown University, and I also am a senior fellow at Tulane's Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy. And a lot of our focus is on communities. And so when we look at this question of the implications of the status quo and why some people fight for the use of the term natural, I appreciate the institutions and systems approach, and it allows me to offer my remarks this morning in this context. When I speak to my students, I say, when we look at systems, we need to look at the underpinnings of what creates systems, attitudes, which have the ability to become policy, and that policy can become law. And then law reshapes communities, how they experience society at large, and in particular, how they experience disasters. Okay. So I'd like to begin with attitudes. This term natural is often used in the United States to refer to the experience or those experiencing some sort of extreme weather or another kind of quote unquote natural hazard is the language that we often use when people are trying to avoid just saying disasters. It indicates that there's some sort of responsibility for someone to take action to respond to the event or to mitigate against the impacts of the event. The language the emergency management enterprise uses in the United States, even our lead agency, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, says the first 72 is on you, right? And we're in National Preparedness Month in September here in the United States. And some of the messaging is you are your own first responder. And what that indicates is that if you, as a stakeholder or a member of a community, particularly falls differently if you're a member of a marginalized or intersectional community, is that if you don't find some way to respond, initiate a response yourself, or to mitigate, perhaps the fault is your own. So what that does is it allows some sections of society, even our response enterprise, to shirk a moral imperative to address the policy decisions, the marginalizations that turn these events into disasters, as opposed to taking a more holistic look, not just at the meaning of the language, but how the use of the language and the operational impact that has falls on communities. When I was preparing these remarks, I was thinking about Puerto Rico. I responded to that event as a surge capacity attorney back in 2017 when we're doing Hurricane Maria, and then returned for the subsequent earthquake issues. About 40% to half of the island have had rolling blackouts or loss of access to public goods for the 5 years since Maria, before they were hit again with Fiona. And we're watching Fiona march towards Nova Scotia, impacting our Canadian neighbors with an event that is quite outside of their experience. And what does that mean? But when we look at Puerto Rico, that's a good example of how attitudes create systems that don't work for the most marginalized. What we had in the case of Maria and the extreme length of time that should have been dedicated to recovery, but was an unsuccessful effort, is, first of all, a lot of misinformation about the nature of Puerto Rico to begin with, and an embarrassing amount of Americans don't realize that they are Americans, or the legal status of the island, that it's a territory, but those people who occupy that territory have the same rights and privileges as Americans who occupy the 50 states and commonwealths. There has been and continues to be an undertone of a lack of capacity to manage their own business on the island of Puerto Rico. We are watching the governor of Puerto Rico being treated vastly differently than the governor of, say, California would have been, or the governor of Louisiana would have been, as they go through this process of directing funding. And so you kind of have to ask, why is this treatment different? And not just why are we using the term natural disaster? This is the fourth event that they've had in X amount of years in the media, but the underlying attitude is that this was a natural event. And there's something inherently skewed about the way that Puerto Ricans respond to it. And we are here to offer assistance in a certain kind of way, but we don't have the responsibility to do a deeper examination of how we use the language and how we apply it to people in the way that affects our behavior, right? Those attitudes, unfortunately, sometimes turn into policy. But if we were to remove the term natural from the equation and take a larger look, what does that mean for the emergency management enterprise? What does that mean for agency policy in the United States? What does that mean in the broader construct of how the United States interacts in international responses? And what does this mean for those of us who are involved in the larger humanitarian system? If we take away natural and we take away this attitude of initial responsibility lies in a certain place, and that there's something that communities must do against the hazard they are faced with in order to receive an appropriate standard of care, an appropriate articulation of operations and policy. What does that actually mean? And why do we like to hang on to this terminology? And what can we do to better understand how we interact with communities? Now, when we talk about the term natural in terms of policy, a lot of times when we say natural disaster in the media, in speeches, in policy dialogues, sometimes even when we are writing law, we're talking about events, which is the ethos of why we're here, hashtag no natural disasters, are events that are actually made or exacerbated by policy. And so these attitudes of there's some responsibility on communities to behave a certain way, or certain elements of society have something inherently flawed about them, which takes our moral imperative to adjust our mindsets and our operations away, becomes policy. And so what does that mean for our work? So let's look at this both in terms of where I'm sitting in the United States, but also largely in the more international scale of things. One of the policies that continues to impact divested communities is this now outlawed practice of redlining. So it's no longer law, but when we look deeper and we ask the question of policy, there's still the de facto practice of redlining, which is discriminatory lending practices, most of the time leveraged against communities of color and sometimes against immigrant communities and other types of divestment. Increasingly, as the US has become more diverse, we found unique and more diverse ways to divest communities. And what that does is redlining sits next to environmental justice issues and sits next to bias zoning issues. So what you will find is that divested communities are not allowed or have not been allowed to borrow and purchase safe housing and safe building spaces away from hazards. They are actually pushed into areas that are hazardous, that are unsafe, and we've co-located them with hazards, right? And then we call it a natural disaster when you have a situation such as Cancer Alley, Louisiana, in my home state. What you have is a divested, mostly low socioeconomic status, white American, Black American community that are co-located with a myriad of heavy industry facilities. They are in an area that is experiencing rapid coastal degradation and land loss and are at outsized risk for sea level rise. But we use the term natural to refer to what's happening to these communities, or we avoid the terms climate change, sea level rise, any of the scientific language that we wrestle with sometimes from a different perspective. But what we've done is by virtue of policy, we've put them there. So what happens if we change the policy? In a capitalist system, we lose profit. There is a cost associated with undoing the impacts of these policies, right? What does it mean if you exit from this practice? If we look internationally, you can look at land rights and minerals treaties and how those practices play out in people's lives. Most of those practices are extractive and again, exacerbate land use policies that cut against communities, particularly the most divested communities, right? It's no accident that the most divested communities are co-located with heavy industry or practices that damage ecosystems. It's no accident that these tend to be racial, gender, religious, ethnic minority, immigrant communities, right? People who do not sit at the top tier of society for one reason or another, through no fault of their own and through no acceptance into the decision matrices that create these structures, right? And I gave you one example of this in the Gulf South. We are watching this play out first in Bangladesh and now in Pakistan. And so to use the term natural allows us to observe. We get to observe these impacts. And we get to adjust our concept of what our moral or policy imperative is in a way that suits our comfort. We can have high-level conversations about loss and damage or payment, but not an examination of the history and the cascading policies that put people in that situation to begin with. So if we took away the term natural, that would force us not only to ask about profit, right? It would force us to examine power dynamics. And even more disturbing for some of us, to examine our comfort level with remediation, right? We would have to face the history that goes along with colonialism and imperialism and look at where policies dating back to the partition, what happened during the 70s, our attitudes from an American perspective towards countries that were part of the then Soviet Union or allied with it, and how those policies of continuous divestment from the outset have taken us to a place where we're watching these extreme impacts hitting divested communities. Would we want to take on the diplomatic risk of having those conversations? So when we're talking about policy, from my perspective, hanging on to the term natural keeps us in a safe and comfortable place and keeps us from having to invest ourselves intellectually and morally in conversations that don't suit our needs to hold on to power, profit, and comfort. And then finally, and unfortunately, the law comes into play. Using the term natural in many cases closes the door to culpability. If it's a natural event, not only do we not have a moral imperative or policy directive to do so, legally we can avoid culpability for some of the damages that have been caused by one set of actors against another actor. Yes. Because if we define something as a force of nature, if we place the onus to manage those impacts on others, that removes the culpability, right? If we, government, companies, moneyed segments of society say that, law, policy, or business practices caused an event, then we open the door to a broader discussion about loss and damage. Is it not just a sovereign to sovereign conversation? Is it a multinational to sovereign conversation? Is it community level? What about reparations, where we can prove expressly where the culpability lies and attach an amount to it? Because all of this costs something. There are many people in this audience who are way more experienced in this than I am. They know that there is a cost associated with this. So if we can define a cost of the damage, do we have to do reparations on the broader scale? Is there a global compact, not just on loss and damage, but on reparations that we would be having to discuss from a legal standpoint more locally?
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to have to ask you to kindly wrap up, if that's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No, thank you for the warning. And so actually, I was to the end of the questioning. So more locally in the United States, what we have to pay for the managed retreat of people in places like Cancer Alley. If people in Puerto Rico have to rethink how much of their land is actually usable, habitable, will we have to pay for that? And so we would want to avoid that kind of culpability, the legal responsibility for it. And the cost and the consequences become broader as we broaden the aperture to look at this globally. So this term natural, attitudes, policy, legal, allows people to push the responsibility and hold on to a certain standard of care as opposed to opening up and having much harder and more difficult discussions and different levels of responsibility for what is actually happening. And thank you so much for your patience. And I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Monica. I'm going to